All right, well, thank you all for joining us today for this first virtual lecture. In the virtual lecture and workshop series, Bio and Psyche, Reading the Symptomatic Body. As I was just explaining to Dr. Webster, Bio and Psyche was originally planned as an in-person symposium to be held in May 2020. And that, for obvious reasons, didn't work out. So we would really like to thank the Rice University Humanities Research Center for allowing us to maintain the funding for this event and for supporting us to transition it to this virtual format. And we especially want to thank Dr. Melissa Baylor, whose insights and whose endless support helped shape this virtual event. And we'd also like to thank Adriana Giamonzi and Paula Platt, whose administrative assistance has helped make this event a reality. We're thrilled to see so many of you join us here today, and I'm assuming more will drop in as I am talking right now. We are quite a large group. A lot of people have signed up, and we've purposely kept this a meeting instead of a webinar. So we would have the opportunity to actually talk to each other and connect as well, which has been quite hard in these virtual formats of late. So please make yourself comfortable, but also be mindful of others and keep your microphones muted. As you can see, this lecture has live captions. If during the lecture you need any further accessibility support, such as image transcription or anything else, please flag Brooke or flag me, and we'll help you out. After Dr. Webster's lecture, you'll have the opportunity to talk to your fellow participants. We'll be putting you in breakout rooms for about 10 minutes. Because as I said, it's much harder to bump into one another in virtual events. So we hope this breakout session will allow you to mingle and meet some of the other people at this lecture and to share your thoughts and questions on the lecture with them before we go into the Q&A. During the lecture, also feel free to use the chat to speak amongst yourselves. Just be mindful that any questions you may pose in the chat during the lecture may get lost in the larger chat. So lecture and Q&A together are scheduled to be approximately an hour and a half, give or take. Everything's recorded and will be uploaded to our website, hrc.rice.edu/biopsyche. We'll be putting links and descriptions to the rest of the lectures of this series in the chat. So please join us every Friday in May for lectures by Christopher Lane, Venus Guinness, and Travis Lau. And join us today for our lecture by Dr. Jamison Webster.
All right. Hi, I'm Alana Barawisa. I am going to introduce Dr. Webster. Thanks for inviting me to this talk, Brooke and Els. It's really a pleasure. I got my PhD at Rice with Brooke and Els, and I finished in 2018. Now I teach at Rutgers in the writing program, and they generously invited me back to do this introduction. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jamison Webster. Dr. Webster is a psychoanalyst in private practice in New York City. She teaches at the New School for Social Research and supervises doctoral students in clinical psychology at the City University of New York. She's also a member of the Institute for Psychoanalytic Training and Research and Das Unbehagen. She is the author of several books, including The Life and Death of Psychoanalysis and Conversion Disorder, Listening to the Body in Psychoanalysis, on which her talk, Conversion Disorder, The Desire for Change, will be drawing today. She also co-wrote with Simon Critchley, Stay Illusion, The Hamlet Doctrine. In addition to her books, Dr. Webster has published a wide range of articles and interviews in academic, art, and literary venues, including, among many others, the New York Review of Books, where she has most recently published essays on the body, psychoanalysis, and care in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and Gagosian Quarterly, where she edited with Alison Gingeras a supplement for the winter 2020 issue called New Interiorities that considers paradigm shifts brought on by 2020's biological, psychological, and social crises across a set of essays, interviews, and art pieces. As in these pieces, her talk today, and hopefully the Q&A to follow, we'll discuss intersections of the body, psychoanalysis, and demands for radical change that recent events from the coronavirus pandemic to Black Lives Matter have brought to the surface. So without any further ado, please welcome Dr. Jamison Webster.
Thank you. Thank you to Brooke. Thank you, Alana, for returning to your postgraduate home, your graduate home. And thank you to Els Woodstra, and thank you for persevering. You know, this was one of those things that was supposed to happen and didn't happen. And I was looking forward to coming to Texas very much, you know, but so here we are, and I'm happy to see everybody. And of course, the format of Zoom, which, you know, has its alienating form, but also allows many of us to come together that otherwise wouldn't be able to, is the sort of atmosphere that we're navigating. And I'm always so happy to see a conference on something like bio and psyche on the symptomatic body, sort of addressing psychoanalytic questions from an interdisciplinary perspective. And, you know, today I'm going to present work roughly based around my book with a chapter that focuses in on the question of conversion in Freud, but starts out sort of expansive, narrows into the way that I've been reading how Freud spoke about it throughout his work, and then tries to kind of zoom back out. So that's a little bit of what you're going to hear today. And then maybe I will never talk about this book again. Maybe this will be the last time. There's something about the pandemic that has sort of brought it to a close. But one thing that I was remembering and thinking, like, maybe this will be the last time I speak about this book. And I also just finished a class on the body that was really nice to have Brooke in. Was that when I launched the book at the very end of 2018, the book came out in October 2018. So then there's like that last year before the pandemic begins, right, 2019. In November of 2018, at the book launch, I had an event called Sick to celebrate the book, in which we made a psychoanalytic field hospital based on Ferenzi's experiences in World War I and beyond, work with groups. And we actually made a hospital where we brought people in as like pseudo patients for the evening and subjected them to very strange forms of torture. But the hospital looked like the kind of hospitals that were put up in New York City and other places during the pandemic. So it was weirdly prophetic, this event, in a way that kind of scares me. And so this talk as well, in taking this book that was published a while ago and trying to understand the implications of it now, also sort of scares me, which is why I want to be done with it. In good ways and bad. So, I mean, that's also something that's going to be inside the talk, within the talk, and something I'll try to touch on a little bit in the moments when I'm trying to zoom out. So I just sort of wanted to preface that. And I hope that I'll get through what I planned, but I'm not always able to do that, because I like to try to talk to you guys personally. So I will go as far as I can without taking up too much time. So let me do a little background on the term conversion, and then I will push on to Freud. So conversion is a late 19th century term that was fashioned to hysteria by Freud, until it eclipses hysteria when hysteria is removed in the 1980s from the DSM, and psychiatry is trying to kick it out altogether, marking seemingly the 100-year anniversary of psychoanalysis with its absence. Conversion, however, as a term remains. Conversion disorder is in the DSM. It's more ambiguous, it's more gender neutral. It's lumped under the heading of the somatoform disorders, or sometimes it's under a new heading, functional neurological symptom disorder. Conversion is also linked to the dissociative disorders as well as alexithymia. The irony here, of course, is that hysteria preceded Freud, from the Greeks to Janet and Charcot, And conversion was a term deployed by Freud, which, as we will see, underlies much of his theoretical work throughout his life, more perhaps even than the esteemed hysteria. So this turning of the tides from conversion to hysteria and back seems to speak to something that insists, certainly on the level of the body, but which is always more than that, such that whatever this consistent reference to the body is meant to imply, it is linked to the history of medicine and psychiatry, linked to psyche and the plight of the feminine even. It is a concept that always hovers on the border, close to the way that Freud worked with his idea of the drive, something that he called a limit concept, or a concept of the limit, or at the limit, in particular the limit between soma and psyche. We might welcome this word conversion, coined in any case by Freud as pure psychoanalytic nomenclature, and which points to something critical, evoking itself as a strange remainder. Why do the spheres of the world want to retain this word in a time that is dispensed with psychoanalysis while rife with problems that circle around religious, economic, and political violence, each one tied to questions of, if not longings for, conversion as transformation and as radical change? So the points where the body speaks of its insoluble pain point to a place where something takes hold. Maybe we could say that it points to the place where the world takes hold of us too much. Religious longing, the impotent attempts to extract politics from theology, a biopolitical era whose force of regulation touches all of us on a bodily level rather than simply a series of mental prohibitions, reaching into every crevice, into every cell, and mirroring the global movements of currency, economic conversions on small and large scales in the background of unthinkable economic disparity and inequality. Conversion speaks to the continuing problems of sex and gender, new wars seen in the politics of sexual and racial violence as it targets us for our bodies is centered on a question of bodies. Maybe conversion will tell us why bodily disorder and the promise of transformation keep slipping into every realm of life, leading up to a global climate crisis and a global pandemic. What conversion are we really hoping for? For me, mysterious diseases seem to travel along the fault lines of culture, slipping through the grasp of Western medicine. Autoimmune disorders were already declared an epidemic 10 years ago before COVID, which we ought to remember is a virus that causes an autoimmune attack. Autoimmunity is the body's signaling system gone haywire, and here, how can we not think of signal anxiety? How can we not think of trauma? But then this isn't a metaphor. The recent discovery of glia cells as linked to autoimmune responses in the brain, the question of whether or not immunity was separate from the brain, they thought there was a firm barrier, but in fact, this hypothesis is now declared wrong, not just like a couple weeks ago. Now connects stress and trauma, autoimmunity with depression, anxiety, and eventually dementia. Glia means glue. It seems to speak to a body too glued to itself. Stasis, a term that I think of when I think of glue, we might remember is Greek for civil war. Stasis is a breakdown in an economy or system of exchange that requires openings at the border between inside and outside. And for the Greeks, stasis was tinder for the fire of an internal strife that must be avoided and amended at all costs. Civil war for the Greeks is always about to erupt and is perhaps simply another name for conversion disorder. Conversion as a word comes from the Latin convertere, which means to turn around or altogether turn, seeming to speak to the minimal difference between repetition and change. Conversion disorder seems to carry with it the absolutely singular my conversion and the universal our disorder together. Everything or nothing, especially in this globalized world, would be overturned. Economically, don't we all turn together? These are the global markets in the 21st century, the new body politic. Conversion, many have said, at least when you go back through the term, arises only with Judeo-Christian religion, or religion insofar as it involves an experience of conversion, a desire to convert. Various pagan religions or cults were more ecumenical, bound to location and culture, changing and evolving with time, introducing new deities, new rites, and new customs, sometimes integrating or assimilating other religions when war brought them into contact. A.D. Nock, in his classic 1933 study Conversion, writes, quote, "By conversion, we mean the reorientation of the soul of an individual, his deliberate turning from indifference or from an earlier form of piety to another, a turning which implies a consciousness that great change is involved, that the old ways were wrong and the new is right. Nock is essentially following Nietzsche on the genealogy of morals, and he wants to demonstrate that prophetic religions and philosophy, as opposed to paganism up to the time of Alexander, worked by conversion, namely the intellectual and emotional conviction regarding the struggle of what is right against what is evil, something that was available to all, not just the wealthy or lettered, who operated more along the lines of something he called adhesion or assimilation, namely taking everything in that can be used for the interests of an empire. Nock seems to implicitly link Nietzsche's desire for the transvaluation of values with conversion, and ultimately he wants to discredit religions of conversion for their moral certainty. He, however, in doing so, begins to paint another portrait, one where conversion is an act whereby something latent meets with a catalyst. He writes, "It's not a conversion from indifference, it's a progress on a continuous line. It's like a chemical process in which the addition of a catalytic agent produces a reaction for which all the elements were already present." The prophet, he says, is someone who knows the hothouse in which he lives, knows how to fuse into white heat the combustible material which is there, to express and to appear to meet the half-formed prayers of his contemporaries. In other words, the prophet is someone who understands how to listen to the prayers of the present. In this picture of conversion, what is right and what is wrong is less at the center than this process of combustion that changes everything for a person, that turns his soul inside out, that reorients him by virtue of something speaking to hidden desires and fears. The older religions, then, the ones that worked by assimilation, lost the battle for whatever historical reasons that left them out of touch with their time. Conversion, then, is not so different from the earlier religions that bore witness, he says, to the obscure power of the gods in everyday life, but which required neither conversion nor belief, since the world around was felt to be enchanted. What conversion does differently is meet the growing need to speak, then, he says, to matters of disenchantment, disappointment, and ennui. It's here where something funny happens, because he's speaking to a disenchantment that reaches back thousands and thousands of years. And here we're trying to place psychoanalytic conversion next to religious conversion as the search for the obscure, for the re-enchantment of desire. You know, we usually separate these. Many have spoken, of course, about the secularization of the West and the rise of psychology and psychoanalysis as what replaced the priests or the new priests. We could also then say then the conversion disorder of today's forms of disenchantment need to be met, need to be addressed, perhaps by the psychoanalyst, but perhaps by anybody. But do we do so then through re-enchantment? Or how would we read the question of re-enchantment if it's not a religion and not, as Freud said, a worldview, and not simply suggestion, not simply an effective transference? What kind of conversion are we speaking about, and what does this have to do with psychoanalysis? In light of this question of conversion, I'd like to make a short interlude. I want to point to a recent article where I was surprised by the mention of conversion hysteria. Jacqueline Rose, in her recent article celebrating the 100th anniversary of Beyond the Pleasure Principle in the London Review of Books, wrote about the impact of the loss of Freud's daughter Sophie to the Spanish flu, and was speaking to the writing, the effects of losing Sophie on the writing of that text and what Freud meant by the death drive. Rose conjectures that Freud's speculations on the immortality of unicellular organisms against the mortality of multicellular organisms due to sex reproduction are about the confrontation of life with its own limit, life that must give itself over to the next stage of life, the next generation, at the limits of the organism. If the child then is the human's only form of immortality, as those who engaged in sex reproduction, if we give our life for our children's life, then the death of a child, especially by accident, is the worst narcissistic injury. Freud says as much about losing Sophie. The pandemic, Rose states then, is no way to die, and certainly no way to lose a loved other. And in this, we have an extreme sense of grief that we are facing or potentially not facing. Rose then surprisingly turns to Freud's paper, A Phylogenetic Fantasy, because it isn't so much about the germplasm, but the Ice Age, a time when life was a kind of hell on earth, perhaps not so different from what we're living through. This time, the Ice Age, is the moment that Freud speculates man turned into an anxious animal. Faced with this emergency beyond control, man imposed on himself a ban on reproduction, gave up on immortality, no future, no children, no glimpse of eternal life. The first response to this curtailing then of the drive was conversion hysteria. I'm going to share my screen. And where is the PowerPoint? Okay. The series is thus: anxiety hysteria, conversion hysteria, obsessional neurosis, dementia praecox or schizophrenia, paranoia, melancholia, mania. I want you to keep this graph in mind, not in order to map out discrete psychopathologies or diagnoses. You clearly see the way that I'm playing with diagnoses, but to see these as layers of history and their place as bodily panic, bodily symptomatic reactions, the move away from the libidinal, and the body by way of its elision into mind, into tyranny, and into magical thinking. This is what Rose writes about it. Man's response to such a brute curtailing of his drives was hysteria. The origins of conversion hysteria in modern times in which the libido is a danger to be subdued. Man also became a tyrant, bestowing on himself unrestrained dominance as a reward for his power to safeguard the lives of many. Language was magic to him. His thoughts seemed omnipotent to him. He understood the world according to his ego. She's quoting Freud a bit there. She says, I love this. Tyranny is the silent companion of catastrophe, as has been flagrantly demonstrated in the behavior of the rulers of several nations across the world today, not least America's soon-to-be, now former president, he who shall not be named, as if to say, I will save you, but you must make me king, not that such rulers save anyone. Not to mention the accompanying idea that the tyrant was the first hysteric. The idea of bodily panic as the unspoken subtext of masculine power is as unexpected and as progressive as any of Freud's thought. Note how political he is being in a text too easily dismissed as sheer fantasy, including by Freud himself. I suggest that we see this paper as a thought experiment, allowing him to take huge and unprecedented mental strides. Perhaps this gives you a sense, I would say, of what psychoanalysts often call the direction of treatment. It's kind of like a conversion chart that guides psychoanalysis, and what in conversion isn't simply the reenchantment as magical thinking and the hypnotic effect of the tyrant, but something else. What Freud is positing is the need to return to origins, to the place of anxiety and the body and libido. So it's on this basis that here I want to return us to Freud's work on conversion hysteria. And I want to show you the way that he uses the term conversion throughout his work. I have a sounding board in my abdomen. If anything happens, it starts up my old pain, said a woman to Breuer in Studies in Hysteria. While hysterical conversion was mostly a feminine problem, the book consists of 5 cases, all women. In the section on hysterical conversion, Breuer is quick to evoke the figure of a man. He writes, all degrees of affective excitability are to be found between, on the one hand, the ideal, which is rarely met with today, of a man who is absolutely free from nerves, whose heart action remains constant in every situation and is only affected by the particular work it has to perform, the man who has a good appetite and digestion, whatever danger he is in, between a man of this kind and, on the other hand, a nervous man who has palpitations and diarrhea on the smallest provocation. The scarce masculine ideal who's free and without nerves, as opposed to the nervous woman with the sounding board in her abdomen that can revive any old pain. We have to remember that it is the electrified, nerve-ridden body of the hysterical woman that gives the ideal, the unprovoked, and at the same time completely undermines it. This man, as is pointed out here, is rarely met with today. But yesterday, before the Ice Age, is that what we're talking about? Some 30 pages later, Freud takes over, as he would do, this hysterics imagery as his own, and he lays down the foundation for the existence of unconscious ideas and the splitting of the mind on the basis of her words. It is not the masculine that proves universal, but his failed other half woman that gives Breuer and Freud a new model of the relationship between mind and body. Freud writes, the impressionability of hysterical patients is indeed to a large extent determined simply by their innate excitability, but the lively affects into which they are thrown by relatively trivial causes become more intelligible if we reflect that the split-off mind acts like a sounding board to the note of a tuning fork. Any event that provoked unconscious memories liberates the whole affective force of these ideas that have not undergone a wearing away. and the affect that is called up is then quite out of proportion to any that would have arisen in the conscious mind alone. What's interesting is that the spontaneity that defines conversion symptoms also defines the women in question. Their bodies and personalities are described in concert. They're lively, they're restless, they crave sensations, they're intolerant of monotony or boredom, they're excitable, they're awakened, they're infantile, kicking and thrashing about, they're suggestible, they're volatile. They have a force of resistance that can go from excessive to rigid to defensive, they're weak and utterly permeable. In the end, what this picture seems to show us is a unity of somopsyche and conversion hysteria, which provides Freud paradoxically with the model of the disunity of the human mind, or perhaps better, the logical ordering of this disorder provides Freud with a similar psychic model. In hysteria, what's so fascinating to Freud is that the natural processes of erosion, wearing away, draining, and leveling out seem not to be present for the hysteric. The sounding board remains a sounding board, while the question of proportion, what's out of proportion with whatever supposed reality, remains simply a value judgment. The goal of psychotherapy eventually, in this text already, is not the removal of whatever could seem here pathogenic, right? That she doesn't wear away, that she has too much affect, that it's all out of proportion. Because how could that be the goal when it seems to define her body and soul, but what Freud eventually comes to call a new state altogether? It's not getting rid of the pathogenic, it's something new that has to be aimed for. It's at this point that I think we find one of the greatest tautologies in psychoanalysis, namely that conversion has to be subject to conversion. And I think it's this that I mean when I use the phrase, the desire for radical change. It's not about the removal of the pathogenic, it's about finding a new state altogether. Through analysis, the patient will, according to Freud, feel freer in the intervals as the work of psychoanalysis gains traction. He says the analyst may not be very free in this course of events because there's a pulsating, oscillating rhythm that analysis establishes on the basis of her symptomatology. But it does, he promises his potential fellow psychoanalysts, there aren't any at that time, right? So he's really speaking to the future. He promises them that this will lead to a space of lesser misery, dropped preoccupation, establishing what he calls an order of the day which corresponds to the state of analysis. The symptom famously joins the conversation, but also seems to transform and extend into the space of analysis and becomes a rhythmic way of being in the oscillation of thoughts, whose peaks, he says, dip down into the unconscious, which is the reverse of what we understand about normal psychical processes. The norm then, essentially, in the way in which the conversion hysteria enters into the analytic atmosphere and takes over, establishes an order of the day, the norm then is turned upside down. It's subverted or overturned. Conversion, again, shows us how we may be converted. Conversion symptoms, Freud implies, are then searching for their own end. He says the symptom will not quit, right? If you want to quit a person's symptoms, good luck. Yet at the same time, what sort of baffles Freud is that the symptom has entirely quit. It's gone somewhere else. It's gone into soma, right? He says it leaves the psychical sphere, it splits the mind, it makes a detour into soma in order to better insist there, and meanwhile leaving the psychic sphere separated off but intact. When Freud compares conversion hysteria with anxiety hysteria or even obsessionality, what becomes clear is that the split soma psyche in conversion creates a pure symptom, if not the true symptom. Because the other symptomatic structures fail in their transformational relation to the psychical dimension, especially insofar as the defensive structure, he says, is simply too permanent. Psyche, he says, in these other structures is undefined. It's like a medial zone of incessant defense and substitution, projection and hallucination, what he calls eventually an unending series of half measures. In a letter to Fleece, while working on his unfinished neurotica, Freud writes about the difference between anxiety hysteria and conversion hysteria. He says, if symptoms of anxiety neurosis are examined more closely, one finds in the neurosis disjointed pieces of a major anxiety attack. This is once again a kind of conversion anxiety, just as occurs in hysteria. But in hysteria, it is psychic excitation that takes a wrong path exclusively into the somatic field, whereas here it is physical tension, which cannot enter the psychic field and therefore remains on the physical path. Hysterical conversion is the reverse face of anxiety conversion, the former moving from the psychic to the somatic, and the latter a failed movement from the somatic to the psyche. This is something that's the basis of much of the psychosomatic school of thought that relies on the idea of unmentalized experiences. A few letters later to Fleece, as Freud begins to try to summarize some of these findings graphically. I love this chart. I think it's really funny and also profound, but funny also. Freud summarizes these findings, and hysteria is the only diagnosis with a satisfactory gain and with an unstable rather than permanent defense structure. Right? Look at the rest of them. I love the fact that hallucinatory confusion is a permanent defense with a brilliant gain. I think that that's what's so funny and profound. The stable instability of the kind of economics of conversion hysteria are a structure, again, that acts like a sounding board to the note of a tuning fork that can become the space of analysis. None of the others can, right? Which is why you have to hystericize an obsessional or hystericize any patient, basically. So all of this diagnostic delineation becomes Freud's, early paper, The Neuropsychoses of Defense. But you have to remember that Freud had wanted to write this kind of like giant DSM like project, which he doesn't do. He just writes that tiny paper, The Neuropsychoses of Defense, gives up on creating a sort of comprehensive system of diagnosis and starts writing the interpretation of dreams, basically, which is very important. I mean, it's obviously the huge moment in the sort of founding of him as the psychoanalyst. Nevertheless, the associative and logical framework of the neuroses, which becomes the associative and logical framework of dreams, nevertheless means that I think we don't escape the stamp of Freud's early work of mapping these neuroses. And in my opinion, not very much changes, except eventually his theory of anxiety, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But I mean, again, with the phylogenetic fantasy that Rose is pointing to, which is still a much later paper that he destroyed, you still see that he was working with these concepts, right? And if he didn't want to write the DSM, it's interesting that the place where they come back up, especially in the phylogenetic fantasy, is to reinsert them into the history of the development of the species, right? Anyways, hysteria from all of this begins to assume its strange place of prominence despite its impending disappearance from Freud's investigative eye, which is finally the deal is sealed in which hysteria disappears when he begins to reclassify anxiety as prior to repression and not subsequent to it. Why? I think it's important to remember that one of the strange characteristics of hysteria is a complete lack of anxiety, what he called her beautiful indifference, which, by the way, is not a far cry from the neutrality of the analyst. What he's saying is that we need repression. We need the repression of anxiety through the creation of a symptom and the structure of dividing the psyche into psyche-soma. Right? When Freud returns to conversion hysteria again in his later work, Inhibition, Symptoms, and Anxiety from 1926, he portrays the most intimate connection between what he calls repression, hysteria, and external anticathexis or scotomization. What Freud means by these terms is a special not wanting to see that the hysteric enacts, which is, on the other hand, a paradoxical vigilance against certain perceptions. The hysterical configuration, characterized by her relationship to amnesia and not knowing, moves in the opposite direction to all of the other diagnoses, which are like especially obsessionality, anxiety, and phobia, which he says use regression and internal anticathexis, right? You could call it a kind of overseeing. So one is a defense against the outside. The hysteric doesn't want to see something out there. The other is a defense against the inside. Freud says that we should understand better how defense turned against the external world leaves the symptom and the personality of the hysteric intact, whereas the cost of the obsessional and phobic anxious ego is so much greater. He writes, I think I cut this down, but he writes, the reaction formation of hysteria clings tenaciously to a particular object and never spreads over into a general disposition of the ego. Whereas what is characteristic of obsessional neurosis is precisely a spreading over of this kind, a loosening of relations to the object, and a facilitation of displacement and choice of object. So he says a woman who will be tender to her children whom she otherwise hates, but not necessarily overly tender to children in general as a person, is a good example of the difference between hysteria and obsessionality and phobia. So what we see here is that the obsessional and phobic patients know what to avoid. Their ego identifies or adapts to the system. And we have, in a pure way, a defense against desire. For Freud, this structural shift is a fortification against the symptom from the inside of the formation of the symptom. This is the quote that is here on the slide. We have seen that in obsessional neurosis, anti-cathexis, which is also presumably present in hysteria, plays especially a large part in protecting the ego by affecting a reactive alteration in it. Our attention has, moreover, been drawn to a process of isolation, which finds direct symptomatic manifestation, and to a procedure that may be called magical of undoing what has been done, a procedure about whose defensive purposes there can be no doubt, but which has no longer any resemblance to the process of repression. So Freud changes his theory of anxiety, right? He thought that anxiety was a consequence of repression. He realizes that it's before repression and we need repression. Therefore, the hysteric is a conversion of anxiety through repression, which is necessary in order to form a symptom and in order to allow for the conversion of conversion to take place. Everything else is happening before then and has not reached the process of repression. In this way, then, the hysteric is the creation and preservation of the symptom. The conversion symptom through repression and somatization appears to be waiting for something, in particular, something it wants to see or find in the external world. The symptom can then act like a parasite on a host. It's unintegratable, it's foreign, it scotomizes reality in order to keep wish alive. It is a life not only lived in daydreams, but of vigilance that corresponds to wish, a wish that can be brought in the transference in order to ask, what is it that you want changed? Without this, in a way, you can't ask what it is that the person wants to change. Amazing moment, and then this is the end of my section on Freud. Freud writes to Fliess concerning what he calls the attraction of others to saints, and saints he's calling hysterical. He says that it's as if when we see them, we are waiting for what has been stored up. And Freud calls this the music of the future. Of course, this music, together with the hysteric sounding board in her abdomen, I think we'll find simply another name for Freud's hysterical unconscious. And if we fast forward from 1894, 1895 to inhibition, symptoms, and anxiety in 1926, we find Freud presaging this current scotomization of hysteria that you now find only under the heading of conversion disorder. This, I think, is Freud's own music of the future when he writes, why the formation of symptoms in conversion hysteria should be such a peculiarly obscure thing, I cannot tell. But the fact affords us good reason for quitting such an unproductive field of inquiry without delay. I think that we could ask, why does Freud give up? I mean, he really throws his hands up at this moment. And after 1926, he still writes for many, many years. He never mentions conversion again. He never mentions it again. Why does he give up on conversion? I think that the reason that he gives up on it is that if the work of analysis becomes synonymous with conversion, where we can see the formation and transformation of symptoms into the analytic process, let's even say the analytic body or the transferential body, it is a mechanism that Freud cannot speak to because it means having to speak about creation. And I think Freud didn't want to do that. Interestingly, one of the places that this brought to mind for me, just when I was thinking of this talk today, was Julia Kristeva's book, Black Sun, where in her idea of the new maladies of the soul that are being created, we have to invest in the idea of creation. She says, how do we understand what creation is? Well, at that point, she talks about the idea that something has to be conveyed. Again, she doesn't use the word conversion, but in conveyed, she's talking about a certain kind of transformation, a kind of production or creation of a new symbolic form. And she says that, some live in a way where what must be conveyed is always already there. The world is magical and provides you with placeful signs to be read. The paradox, she says, is that nothing needs to be conveyed. If we live in mystical immanence, we are unarmed against pain that she says will strike like an axe. I ask you here also to think of like the assimilationist religions. Melancholia, she writes, is about mastering pain. It's a fight against pain, which is also the pain of conveyance itself as the need to master, to know, to speak, to communicate. It's actually over communication. She says melancholics are incredible wordsmiths with a profusion of personal styles. However, this proliferation of fashions is a betrayal of the unique thing to be conveyed, since it's completely dissolved in the 1,001 names of speaking it. She says this is the hidden violence of a melancholic world order. She says, however, in times where the choice seems to be between this kind of living in mystical immanence and having no measures against pain, or melancholic times where we're trying to defend constantly against pain, the thing that we need the most is the creation of new symbolic forms, of which neither of them want. It's interesting because I thought a little bit about Freud's thoughts on melancholia, and especially his early thoughts in his letters to Fleece. And it was interesting to me that when Freud compares hysteria and melancholia, he does so on the grounds of a history of sexual anesthesia, an inhibition at the level of the body that he says is important to grapple with. He brings up this graph, which I think is beautiful for the purposes of this conference, Bio and Psyche. And so this is his model of the body. And you see there the external world is the sexual object. And down here, he's got the end organs and the sensations of pleasure that are trying to reach psyche up here at the boundary of the soma psyche. And it's this beautiful kind of Mobius strip. And you have to pass through this boundary of psyche and also into the external world to kind of wrap the drive around the object and try to reach some form of satisfaction. And part of what he uses this graph to show is that the object is in a position to provide the psyche with feelings of pleasure instead of mere tension and longing, through a reawakening that nevertheless has to happen on the level of the body. So the finding of the object is always a sexual schematic refinding. What's also of interest is that Freud characterizes a loss in instinctual life as the cost of civilization. In this diagram, he uses hysteria, anxiety, and melancholia are markers of varying costs, he says, of civilized sexuality, where some loss to this kind of circuit of the libido is constantly enacted. And Freud then says, we know this, that the analyst tries to put this back in motion in the way in which it's stopped by civilization. And, of course, the hysteric is the one for whom, there's the preservation of the intensity, the sort of affective intensity of this circuit, right? Which is why it's so easily brought into the analytic atmosphere. I think if you think about this, what's interesting is that Freud declares then psychoanalysis to be antisocial or asocial, since it returns to the patient and returning to them the free movement of this sexual schematic finding and refinding. It returns to the patient through this what civilization wants to take from them. He writes, if the ethical restrictions demanded by society play a part in the deprivation imposed on the patient, treatment can, after all, give him the courage or even an injunction to disregard those barriers and achieve satisfaction and recovery while forging the fulfillment of an ideal that is exalted but so often not adhered to by society. The patient will thus become healthy by living, quote, a full life sexually. This, it is true, casts a shadow on analytic treatment for not serving general morality. What it has given to the individual, it will have taken it from the community. Again, this is a point that Freud only makes a little bit, but it's there. And again, I'm tying it to the idea of creation and conversion. Let me just end with some thoughts about conversion disorder at this current moment in time, and then we'll stop. It's difficult to generalize, obviously, about the current moment, but I do think that if I survey my practice, and this is what led to the writing of the book, everyone is troubled by what it means to have a body and their relation to this body as a libidinal body, and searching for the point of conversion. What I hear about is that the iPhones are making us sick and mirror an economy of addiction. We have bodies that are desperately searching for an orientation, if that's in gender or even if that's in sexuality, which is oh so confusing. Millennials crave ayahuasca ceremonies and treatment by hallucinogens, the pain and unease of living in a racialized body, to say nothing of the pandemic and its unmanageable anxiety and massive agoraphobia. And even, I would say, what I listen to as the violent entitled demand of privilege is the feeling of integrity in being in a white male body. Much of life seems to increasingly take place via a sort of streamlining, like the way the internet does, that wants to cater to one's supposed preferences. But life tailored to the demands of preferences in work or lifestyle, supposedly chosen truths, is increasingly mediated by virtuality, and so distance on the one hand while shot through with sentimental and aggressive claims to authentic experience. The body in this seems to be both something that is attacked and that's elided, and which also then rebels, even when lifestyle tries to then cater to this body in protest, perhaps best seen in dieting or exercise, usually yoga, Pilates, or meditation, or even just a generalized ethos of well-being. Something just is never right. And we don't know what to do with this body of ours at a time when the demands made upon it are growing more and more extreme. This, in a way, characterizes a certain turn in philosophy since Foucault, called biopolitics, namely the way control in society isn't any longer a symbolic code that one internalizes, but rather something that keeps us in line by targeting our bodies and manipulating its libidinal economy. Politics is said to be increasingly defined by bodies that count and bodies that do not count, bodies that will be grieved and bodies that are not. And the effect takes place on a bodily level. Take, for example, what Derek Hook writes about racism, Brooke knows this, or some of my students who are here too. What quickly becomes clear is that this dissonance between registers, the attempted conversion of the unpalatable real of the bodily in symbolic terms of sociocultural reformulation, gives rise to a virulent series of social and ideological formations. This conversion, I was very happy to see you use the word, is undoubtedly effective in as much as the problem of bodily disavowal becomes in race supremacist cultures a medium for the development of racist systems and fantasies, yet it is dysfunctional as it produces in excess a set of symptomatic effects that return to haunt and destabilize the ideological system that has supposedly been secured in the process. It's very profound what he's writing, actually. Disruption of modes of enjoyment, breakdown in the dialectic between body and ego could be called the field of the psychosomatic effects of racism. I'm going to stop sharing and then I'll finish. Patients, I think, have a very difficult time speaking to this arena, this effect, not just in race, but in general, right? At times, I think all one hears is the diffuse and vociferous voice of anxiety, which, as we saw and what we were reading in Freud, doesn't allow for the symptom that can spread into the analysis. So you're really stuck either with anxiety or with obsessional defenses or with worse than that. What I hear behind this is that they take the pressures and pains and protests in their body personally, meaning they assume a kind of guilt in relation to their existence. It's their failure that they don't achieve wealth, that they don't achieve success, that they don't achieve beauty, that they don't achieve orgasmic pleasure. And in a stagnant phantasmagoric economy of excess enjoyment and excess culpability, it is one that easily reverses into rage-filled blame, a politics of hate. But within all of it, I hear a deep longing for a way out, for a conviction to pursue something else, a desire to just change sets entirely. I have to say, I wrote this book like 2016, 2017, editing 2018. And the upshot of the Trumpists or even the Brexiteers who funneled this desire for change into entirely destructive forms, culminating, for example, in what we saw as the events in the Capitol. I was really kind of horrified by the book. Even if it was the result of listening to patients and listening to the history of what the desire for change is about, psychoanalytically speaking, to think of the way in which it's being used, I was very uncomfortable with sort of what I was talking about. You know, I understand the background of anxiety and uncertainty, the rush for answers, the craziness around what constitutes truth, this need to place our bodies into the schematic picture of life. A question that is around all of us about saving lives and removing our bodies and breath, or blandly accepting the death of others as mere statistics and allowing our bodies to roam free at will. You know, a lot of what I thought about was the relationship, for example, that takes place in all of this between thinking and conviction. While this is certainly one of our ills, dogmatism requires very little thought. Thought is not necessarily the antidote to the doctrinaire. There is as much of an excess of interiority as there is exteriority, and one is constantly pitted against the other. One of the wagers in the book, Conversion Disorder, is that by working with the question of the body, working with the conversion process of psychoanalysis, knowing the weight and pressure of what it means to keep the body present and doing so at the limit, we ease a path through the deadlock between the endless suspension and anxiety and paralysis of thinking and thinking and thinking and being anxious and anxious and anxious, as the paragon of insideriness, interiority, and the carelessness of immediacy that exemplifies life lived supposedly on the outside. But what makes me so uncomfortable is that this is something that I only understand that I can do as a psychoanalyst, and I don't understand what implication it has on a broader level. And that's what made me uncomfortable, seeing this transformed into very serious global questions and really only having the perspective or stance of the analyst. My other wager in a lot of this is that what we're speaking about when we speak about the body and we speak about listening to the body and the transformations that are required is that we are dealing with the sexual. And how can I speak about this? How can I speak about the careful work of the analyst in dealing with the sexual on this level in a time when the interest in sex has declined 15% in the past several years, supposedly? Or my other favorite statistic, in Japan, 47% of people say they're disgusted by sexuality. And if psychoanalysis says that all of these deadlocks are first and foremost sexual in nature, then what is this asking of us? One becomes an analyst because one believes in the power of openings, of revelations, of reversals, of breaks to a system that bring the possibility of a new body, new sensualities, new symptomatic configurations. But one also becomes an analyst because one believes in repetition, in trauma, in defense, in fantasy, and entrenchment. The analyst, it is true, is always caught between these two. And it's felt, by the way, I think, in the body of the analyst, which is met by the patient as an open or closed conduit. In what profession, for example, one as analyst remain at this threshold for so long? A lot of what I talk about in the book is that sometimes I don't want to be an analyst anymore. Sometimes I think it's too hard, and sometimes I think it takes a toll on my body. Lacan said that in being the cause of the patient's desire, meaning that something in the analysis allows this desire to be caused, that whole like schematic, sexual, beautiful graph that you are causing this thing to turn. You are the one who meets their desire for change, but you do so in your body. You embody the possibility of that, which has a lot to do with the transference fantasies about you. He says that you are inviting and allowing these patients to live in your body, and that what happens in a treatment happens because of this living out something there. Thus, the analyst needs to have had an experience of conversion, and this is the whole business about the analyst analysis. A change in their libidinal economy that, in particular, if you're going to be an analyst, which is why that analysis has to go much further than, let's say, someone else's who just wants a certain form of symptomatic relief, that the conversion of the analyst is the most extreme conversion that analysis demands, is one that allows these people to live in your body, right? And it's one that I feel sometimes is too much to bear, even for me. And so then what does that mean for the rest of us? I'll stop there.